Released in 1979, Highway to Hell was AC/DC's big commercial breakthrough. Despite having success, gaining a loyal fanbase through constant touring, and often playing multiple shows a day, they hadn't quite cracked it on an international scale. Their record label Atlantic knew their potential was much greater in terms of worldwide sales. Powerage, released in 1978, had been their biggest selling album up until that point, eventually gaining platinum status, but it failed to make the Billboard Top 100 despite being a fan favourite. To facilitate a more commercial appeal, the record company were adamant that they needed to try a fresh approach and move away from their usual production team of Harry Vanda and George Young, the older brother of Angus and Malcolm. This idea really didn't sit well with the band, even causing a bit of tension at the time. Ultimately, the band acquiesced as Atlantic brought in acclaimed producer-engineer Eddie Kramer. Kramer had a who's who CV, featuring the likes of Jimi Hendrix, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Kiss, among others. Kramer joined the band in Sydney at Albert Studios to record some demos, before flying off to Miami to begin recording proper. The band and Kramer spent a good few weeks at Criteria Studios, but despite Kramer's credentials and the band's growing talents, nothing was working, with the band becoming more and more disillusioned with the process. Malcolm Young remembers, "We showed him the riffs for Highway to Hell, and he didn't quite get it. We thought, this guy's out of touch with what we are. And at the same time, I suppose any ideas that Eddie had didn't seem to inspire us. I don't know why, but he kept talking about pianos. Maybe he thought that a piano was an interesting thing for a rock and roll band, but that was the wrong word to use around us." Upset with the way things were going, the band told Kramer that they were going away for the weekend, but instead returned to the studio to cut their own demos the way they wanted them. These were then sent to producer Mutt Lange, who was impressed and agreed to step in and replace Kramer. The future legend of production Mutt Lange was an established but still up-and-coming talent at the time, who had had hits with the Boomtown Rats and came with a reputation of being meticulous when it came to all aspects of the recording process. With the band still wary of letting someone else into their creative circle, the initial 2-day session took place in a no-frills rehearsal room in London. Mutt played a key role in shaping the arrangements for the songs, but crucially, in a way that the band appreciated. Some friction did occur when Mutt got involved in fine-tuning Bond's lyrics and delivery though, but in the end, they all agreed that these changes were for the best. The group had always recorded live in the studio, and Highway was no different. Mutt realised they were a great band who could play their instruments, so he just let us go for it, said Malcolm. The freedom was there, and we gave him the freedom as well. We would try anything he asked of us. He'd have us play our songs, and then he'd record them on his little tape recorder. Then he came back the next day, with all his ideas organised, and he'd tell us exactly where he wanted things rearranged, and where the little breaks could be added. For example, he put in the great break near the end of Highway to Hell, where the band drops out, and I scraped the pick down the strings. Angus was playing his 1970 Gibson SG into a Marshall JTM 50. Many people have confused the amp for a JTM 45, but he actually preferred the often forgotten JTM 50. The 50 was a transitional amp between the JTM 45 and the JMP series, and had a few key sonic differences that set it apart and which Angus liked. Saturation levels were different on the 50, and depending on the version, it came with either a solid state or tube rectifier, with Angus preferring the solid state. This gave him a tighter, punchier response. He remarked, "I found that the Marshall 50 Watters produced the best sound in the studio. I can get more drive out of them, which also suits the tonal differences in our guitars." He also had his 1959 100-watt Super Lead on hand, but it's not clear how much it was used compared to the JTM 50. Famous for not using any effects pedals, Angus did use something between his guitar and amp that is definitely unusual in the studio, but a key part of his sound. The Schaefer Vega Diversity System was the first wireless unit and created in 1975 by Ken Schaefer. It was a godsend for rock acts like Kiss and Pink Floyd that were performing on large stages, allowing more freedom in what they could do without the restriction of a long lead. Today, wireless units strive for transparency, and you wouldn't consider it to be an effect of any kind. But the SVDS unit contained a preamp along with some very sophisticated audio processing circuitry involving the packaging and unpackaging of the signal at the transmitter and receiver. This method of unpacking the signal is called companding, and it's said to be the basis for the unit's unique sound, although the preamp certainly has something to do with it as well. The original run of the SVDS ended in the early 80s. Today, Solo Dallas makes recreations of the original units, and pedals designed to replicate some of the tonal qualities of the originals. Ken Schaefer actually installed a transmitter unit into the body of Angus's SG, which is why you don't see it on his strap on the Highway to Hell tour. He used Marshall 4x12 cabs, lightly containing the Celestion blackbacks, which were fairly standard at the time. Malcolm's setup was his trusty 1963 Gretsch Jet Firebird, nicknamed the Beast, into his 1971 Marshall Super Bass amp, again into Marshall 4x12 cabs, lightly containing Celestion G12H30s. The cabinets were mic'd up with two Shure SM57s and a Sennheiser MD421, with the mics combined, depending on the tone they were going for. Bassist Cliff Williams didn't get his Music Man Stingray until on the Highway to Hell tour, so it's likely he was using his Fender Precision with flat wound strings into an Ampeg B15 amp. A DI was also taken and blended with the amp sound. Bon Scott was singing through the Neumann FET 47. This particular mic was well suited for his powerful singing style. Phil Rudd was using his Sonar drum kit, although it's unclear what mics were used. What is clear is that the Chalk Farm live room was relatively dry sounding compared to a lot of other studios, and Mutt recorded the band with quite a lot of separation in order to get a punchy defined sound. This was noted by Tony Platt, who was brought in to mix the album. This took place at Basin Street Studios, where Tony used a technique he called ambient glue in order to liven the sound up a bit, Tony explains. It was a technique that I used on a number of occasions actually. I just wanted to have the sound from each of the microphones or instruments bleeding onto the other instruments. It's something that I call ambient glue. It's what makes up the spaces between the instruments, so it helps it stick together. It's pretty simple really. You just choose certain microphones and feed them through a pretty hefty set of speakers in the recording room. You then put a couple of microphones up and feed that back into the mix. It's not that dissimilar to adding reverb from chambers, but it's under a slightly more controlled situation. And of course, it's a lot drier than it would be with chambers, where you're actually encouraging more reverb and resonance. What you're doing here is just really adding the sound of a room onto the sound of the instruments. It was mixed on a Helios console, which had some F760 compressors built in, although according to Tony, these were only used a little. He said, "I really only had the EMT 140 plates, DDL tape delay, and the Uri 1176. It was the same room and board where I mixed Bob Marley and the Wailers' Catch a Fire." The album was released in July 1979 and became the first album of theirs to break the US Billboard Top 100, reaching number 17. Highway to Hell quickly became a hard rock anthem that has remained incredibly popular to this day. Not really surprising, considering it was made with a perfect storm of a great band in its prime, coupled with an ambitious and hungry producer in Mutt Lange. Of course, tragedy was just around the corner for the band with the death of their frontman Bon Scott, with many believing it would be the end of the band, which is understandable given the unique nature of his voice. What happened next though is considered to be the greatest comeback in rock and roll, with the band returning with new singer Brian Johnson to deliver the best-selling rock album of all time, Back in Black. You can click on this video to watch how they did it.